The first time the trays came back untouched, the guards thought it was just another quiet act of defiance. But by nightfall, it became clear the men inside Pelican Bay's security housing unit were doing the one thing the prison feared most, moving in absolute silence. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. Pelican Bay's SHU wasn't just a building. It was a machine designed to erase people without ever touching them. No windows. No sunlight. Concrete cells the size of walk-in closets. 23 hours locked in, 1 hour alone in a concrete yard the size of a dog run. Some men hadn't seen real daylight in years. And in early 2002, something inside that machine began to crack. It started with a rumor drifting down the tier, barely more than a whisper. A date. A time. A plan that had no paper trail, no spoken meetings, no coded letters that could be intercepted. Men who were never allowed to stand face to face found a way to coordinate anyway. A refusal. One meal at a time. At first, officers dismissed it as typical SHU stubbornness. But on the third day, when hundreds of trays remained untouched across multiple pods, the gravity of what was unfolding became impossible to ignore. The prison rushed to contain it. Medical staff were ordered to log vitals. Guards were told to identify instigators, even though no one had spoken a word. Administrators tried the classic tactic, wait it out, let the protest burn itself to ash. But these men weren't acting out of impulsive anger. They were operating on something deeper, years of isolation, years of being labeled validated gang members with no path out, years of living under a system that didn't just confine bodies, it buried identities. The hunger strike wasn't about privileges or food. It was about proving they still existed. Indefinite solitary is killing us, one man wrote in a legal complaint months later. But in 2002, no reporter, no advocacy group, and no member of the public ever saw those words. The strike was swallowed by Pelican Bay's walls long before it reached anyone who might have listened. Inside, the atmosphere hardened. The air grew heavier. Every door slam echoed louder. Guards patrolled with a new edge, stern, suspicious, waiting for a spark. Inmates grew weaker, but not quieter in conviction. Their silence became a message officials couldn't decipher, and that uncertainty made the administration uneasy. On day 5, the warden authorized a controlled crackdown. Extra cell searches. Behavioral write-ups. A few quiet transfers to other facilities. It wasn't officially labeled retaliation, but everyone inside knew exactly what it was. Still, the men held the line. They weren't asking for freedom. They were asking for daylight. For meaningful review. For a future where a man could earn his way out of the SHU instead of aging into it. Some guards viewed the protest as manipulation. Others, as private conversations later revealed, felt something closer to sympathy. Even they could see that keeping human beings in a box for years without change didn't just test sanity, it bent it. On the 7th day, with medical reports becoming harder to ignore, the administration made a strategic move. Not a concession. Not a reform. Just enough of an adjustment to claim the crisis was addressed. Within hours, the strike began to fracture. Some men resumed eating. Some didn't. All knew the same truth, the system hadn't changed, only the tactics used to quell them. But something else had shifted, quietly, beneath the surface. For the first time, Pelican Bay's SHU had learned what terrified officials most: men separated by concrete and steel still found ways to unite. And the administration knew this wasn't the last time. The administration called it a resolved incident, but inside the SHU, nothing felt resolved. Something had shifted, quietly, dangerously, and everyone knew it. What unnerved officials wasn't the hunger strike itself. It was the coordination. In a place engineered to sever human connection, hundreds of men had moved with the precision of a single mind. No notes. No conversations. No meetings. Just timing, perfect, impossible timing. Behind those concrete walls, unity was supposed to be impossible. After the strike, investigators combed every pod looking for the source, convinced someone had orchestrated it. The SHU's internal intelligence unit pulled old files, reviewed gang validation folders, and flagged anyone with influence in their records. But the truth was far more unsettling. This wasn't a plot built by a leader. It was born from desperation shared across an entire unit. And desperation doesn't leave fingerprints. Still, the investigation triggered a wave of pressure that rippled through the cells. Random cell extractions. Property taken. Notes confiscated, even legal papers. Everything became suspect. To the administration, silence wasn't just resistance, it was evidence. Some officers walked the tiers with a clipped confidence, convinced the protest was a stunt. Others carried themselves differently, more watchful, more measured, because they'd seen things the public never would. Under the fluorescent glare, they saw men who hadn't touched another human being in years. Men who were losing weight in years at the same pace. Men whose eyes dimmed not from violence, but from absence. Isolation didn't leave bruises, but it left marks. Inside the cells, the psychological pressure tightened. Some inmates felt it like a slow pull, the kind that wears down resolve. Others sensed something more volatile, an unspoken demand from officials to pick a side, comply or get buried deeper in the system. And yet, beneath all the tension, something else was growing. Whispers traveled in ways no one could trace. Not spoken, not written, just understood. A guard's shift change. A subtle pattern in when doors opened. The way medical staff moved with urgency one day and indifference the next. The SHU wasn't just concrete, it was a language of patterns. Men who lived there long enough became fluent. The hunger strike had taught them that timing was their only currency. Weeks after the protest ended, it became clear the administration wasn't interested in reform. Internal memos circulated with phrases like temporary policy adjustments and no permanent alteration to SHU procedures. The message was unmistakable: the structure of solitary confinement wasn't up for debate. But the inmates had learned something too: California's system might bend, but only under sustained pressure. One inmate, writing in tiny letters on the back of a legal envelope, captured the sentiment without ever intending for the world to see it: "They think we're alone in here. They don't understand what a man can hear through concrete." That line passed quietly from cell to cell before the envelope disappeared during a property search. No one knew where it went. Some believed it was thrown out. Others believed it was copied. But the words stayed alive because they resonated with something the strike had exposed: isolation could be controlled, but not completely. Then came the shift no one inside expected. During a routine review, an officer found a discrepancy in a cluster of disciplinary files related to SHU assignment dates, minor errors, barely worth a correction. But when he brought them to a supervisor, the reaction was immediate and strange. The files were taken. The conversation ended. And the officer was reassigned to a different unit the next week. Rumors spread fast. Something about those documents wasn't just wrong, it was sensitive. For men who had spent years trying to find any crack in the system, the discovery changed everything. If paperwork could be altered, even subtly, then the structure keeping them inside the SHU wasn't unbreakable. It just looked that way from the outside. And buried in those unexplained file changes was a clue, small, overlooked, but powerful enough to shift the entire landscape of resistance. What they didn't know yet was who else had noticed it. The clue didn't come from a whistleblower, a lawyer, or an outside investigator. It came from the most unlikely place: the same overlooked administrative files the SHU relied on to decide who stayed in isolation and for how long. One missing signature here. A mismatched date there. A form stamped twice by two different supervisors. Tiny details, meaningless on their own. But together, they pointed to something inmates inside Pelican Bay had long suspected: the system wasn't just rigid, it was inconsistent, and those inconsistencies determined the fate of hundreds of men. The discovery spread quietly along the tier, passed in fragments through the ventilation system, reflected in small gestures from cell to cell. Even without speaking, they understood the implications. If paperwork could be flawed, then indefinite solitary wasn't a justified sentence, it was a process built on shaky ground. And shaky ground can shift. Meanwhile, the administration sensed the change in atmosphere. The tiers felt different, more alert, more focused. Not rebellious. Not chaotic. Just aware. And awareness inside a place built on control was dangerous. Officials increased monitoring. They tightened property limits. Men were told their files were under review, a phrase that usually meant nothing. But this time, it meant something else entirely. Someone inside the system realized the inmates weren't fighting a single policy, they were learning how the system worked. And that made them harder to contain. It didn't take long for the pressure to push back. A sudden wave of transfers scattered key inmates to different facilities across the state. Some were moved without explanation, woken in the middle of the night, shackled, and taken out before anyone knew they were gone. It was a quiet attempt to break the growing unity. But separation didn't have the effect officials hoped for. Being scattered only widened the network. Men who had once been isolated in the SHU now carried their experience and their knowledge into new prisons. They spoke to lawyers. They wrote to advocacy groups. They shared the truth with anyone willing to listen. Pelican Bay's system wasn't invincible, just protected by silence. In early 2002, that message didn't ignite public outrage. It didn't lead to legislative hearings or media coverage. The hunger strike faded into obscurity, buried under routine administrative reports and internal memos no one outside the walls ever saw. But something permanent had changed. For the first time, inmates across California understood they could push back, not through riots or violence, but through coordinated pressure, shared information, and documentation. The 2002 strike wasn't a failure, it was a blueprint. A quiet rebellion carried in empty trays and in signed forms. Years later, when the world finally paid attention to the massive 2013 hunger strike, people asked how thousands of inmates across dozens of prisons had organized so effectively. How they managed to communicate demands, track participants, and build a movement that forced California to rethink parts of its solitary confinement system. The answer wasn't found in 2013. It was found in 2002. In that first silent protest. In those unnoticed files. In the moment men in the SHU realized the system could be challenged if they learned how it worked from the inside. Those early acts of resistance didn't make headlines. They didn't change policy overnight. But they changed people. And those people carried the movement forward until the rest of the world finally heard what they had been trying to say for over a decade. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.